Leone had always known she was different, though the full weight of it didn't settle on her shoulders until she turned 10. It began subtly, in the way the other children would sometimes glance at her and then quickly look away, or how their mothers would murmur disapprovingly whenever she passed. Her hair was the source of it all, long black as midnight, and flowing down to her feet like a curtain of shadows. It was hair that had never seen scissors, never known a comb made of iron, and never been touched without permission. Her mother, Sira, insisted it was a gift from the river gods, a blessing that marked Leone as sacred. Sira's voice would rise like a chant when she told the story, how Leone had been born during the Great Flood, the night the river rose and threatened to drown the whole village. The villagers had gathered on the hilltop shrine, praying, sobbing, their voices frantic in the storm. Then a strange calm fell. The waters began to recede, and at that very moment, Sira gave birth to a child with hair already curling around her shoulders like ivy. The midwife had screamed. The elders called it unnatural. But Sira, her face glowing in the firelight, only whispered, "She is chosen." From that day, Leone's hair grew with a life of its own. It was thick and heavy but never tangled. It shimmered faintly in moonlight and rippled when the wind touched it. Sira forbade anyone to cut it, saying the river gods would curse whoever tried. The villagers were uneasy, but they left the matter alone, at least for a time. The village of Kedu was a place where tradition reigned above all else. The people walked barefoot in the temple square, never raised their voices in public, and followed the old codes that had been etched into stone generations ago. The elders, 7 of them all robed in pale blue, sat like stones in their judgment hall watching everything. Their word was law and no one dared cross them. They believed in order, in silence, in submission. To them, Leone's hair was not just a symbol, it was a rebellion. They whispered that it made her vain, made her wild. It was too long, too bold, too free. Despite their disapproval, Leone grew into a quiet but strong-willed girl. She did not flinch under stares, did not shrink away from whispers. She walked with her head high, her hair sweeping behind her like the train of a queen's robe. Children began to ask questions. Girls tried to grow their hair longer too. The elders saw this as dangerous. They warned parents to keep their daughters disciplined, neat, and obedient. When Leone turned 15, the tension finally boiled over. It was the day of purity, a sacred day when every girl in the village wore white and walked through the temple square in silence to be blessed by the elders. They were expected to have their hair bound, their eyes lowered. But Leone refused. She walked barefoot like the others, but she wore her hair unbound, flowing like a river, dark against her pale dress. The air grew still as she passed the elders. Her chin was up. She did not flinch. Gasps rippled through the crowd. One of the elders, the oldest, narrowed his eyes and muttered something under his breath. The others leaned together and whispered fury. But Leone kept walking, her mother standing quietly at the edge of the square, her face unreadable. That night the elders gathered. Their patience had run dry. To them, Leone had committed blasphemy. Her defiance was not just against tradition but against the gods themselves. They summoned her the next morning, dragging her by the wrist into the square. A crowd had already formed, eyes wide, mouths tight. The air felt heavy, charged. Leone stood tall, refusing to beg. Her mother was not there. The elders declared her guilty of arrogance, of spreading corruption among the girls of the village, of defying sacred tradition. They sentenced her to the cut, a punishment so rare it had become legend. She felt the first hand press her shoulder, the second clutch the base of her hair. A knife was drawn, not sacred, not ceremonial, just an old blade used for slaughtering goats. It gleamed cruelly in the morning light. She did not cry when the blade sliced through the thick cords of her hair. But when the final cut was made and her hair dropped in a heavy coil onto the ground, something inside her broke. Her scalp stung. Blood trickled down the back of her neck. The crowd gasped. Some turned away. She felt naked. Not because her body was bare, it wasn't, but because something sacred, something that had always been hers, was gone. Torn from her. Her head throbbed, her body trembled, but still she did not speak. She looked straight at the elders with hollow eyes. They had wanted submission, but they had created something else entirely. After the punishment, Leone was left in the square, her hair lying like a dead serpent at her feet. The villagers scattered. No one dared speak to her. Children hid behind doors. Her scalp still bled as she picked up the shorn pieces and walked home alone. Her mother was waiting. For a long moment she said nothing. Then she wept, not loud, not wailing, but silently, bitterly, as she cradled her daughter in her arms. That night, Sira burned the cut hair in a clay bowl, whispering old chants Eluni had never heard before. Smoke rose, thick and bitter, and Eluni watched it with dry eyes. The days that followed were slow and cold. Eluni did not go outside. She wrapped her head in cloth, avoided the mirror. But something had shifted. A storm was building inside her, quiet and strong. Her dreams became strange. She saw rivers rising, trees uprooted, the sky dark with birds. She heard whispers in water, saw shadows beneath the surface. Then, 3 nights later, the rains returned. It began as a drizzle, soft and harmless. But soon, it poured, a constant, ceaseless deluge that turned paths into mud and fields into swamps. The villagers prayed. They fasted. But the rain did not stop. Roofs leaked. Goats drowned. The river swelled. One morning, as the village woke to find their wells flooded and their crops drowned, Eluni stood in the square. She wore white. Her hair was wrapped, but her presence was unmistakable. She stared at the elders who had gathered to discuss the calamity. Her voice was quiet but clear. "You took what was sacred," she said. "You brought this on yourselves." The villagers gasped. One elder stepped forward, ready to shout her down, but a gust of wind silenced him. The air grew thick, wet, charged with something unnameable. Eluni raised her hand. The clouds darkened. Sira stepped forward then, her old eyes shining. She joined her daughter in the square, chanting in the old tongue, not the prayers of the village but something older. The river gods, it seemed, had not forgotten. The rain fell harder, but the water did not touch Eluni. It parted around her, a perfect circle of dry earth. The villagers saw it and fell to their knees, whispering prayers they barely remembered. The elders watched, pale and shaking. Eluni turned to the river path and began to walk. Sira followed. The crowd parted. They walked until they reached the riverbanks, where the water foamed like a beast in chains. Eluni stepped forward, removed the cloth from her head, and let the rain touch her bare scalp. Then she knelt and touched the water. The river calmed. The sky lightened. The wind stopped. And then, slowly, as if drawn by unseen hands, strands of hair began to rise from the water. First one, then many, black and shining, alive. They curled around her, weaving themselves into her scalp, growing, twining, twisting. Within moments her hair had returned, longer, darker, stronger. It shimmered with silver threads and swayed though the wind was gone. The villagers wept. The elders dropped their staffs. One tried to crawl away, but the river surged and blocked his path. Eluni turned to them, her voice now echoing with something far older than her years. "You cut me because you feared what you could not control. But you cannot cut the river. You cannot bind the storm. I am both." Then she turned and walked away, her hair flowing behind her like water in motion. From that day forward, the village of Kadu changed. The elders were stripped of power. A new shrine was built, not of stone but of woven reeds and river clay. Eluni became its guardian, not a priestess in the old way but something new. Children came to her for stories, women for strength. Girls grew their hair long again. And though the rains would come and go, they never brought flood again. Not as long as Eluni lived by the river, her hair gleaming, untamed, and eternal. After Eluni's punishment, the villagers moved quickly, as if her hair might come alive on its own if left too long in one place. The elders ordered it divided, some to be burned in the temple hearth, some buried in the garden behind the judgment hall, and the rest released to the wind so that its arrogance might be scattered and lost. No one was allowed to keep a peace. The women who carried out the task did so with gloved hands and averted eyes. Even they were afraid of it. Thick black strands, still faintly warm, were stuffed into linen sacks and distributed among 3 groups, each tasked with their part in the disposal. At the temple, the fire flared oddly when the hair was thrown in. The flames hissed and crackled, growing momentarily blue before settling. The villagers watching from a distance whispered among themselves, unsure what they had just seen. In the garden, the women dug furiously, burying the coils of hair beneath salt and ash. They muttered old prayers, half-remembered and trembling on their tongues. Those tasked with scattering the last bundle climbed the ridge just beyond the village and released it to the wind. It floated out in strange curls and loops, carried swiftly into the darkening sky. A few strands clung to their fingers even after the bags were empty. Meanwhile, Eluni had been locked in the punishment hut near the edge of the forest, a place usually reserved for thieves or drunks. It was small and cold, its single window barred, the door chained from the outside. There was no fire, no food, only silence and stone. They told her to reflect on her disobedience, her pride, her corrupting influence. She sat still for hours, staring at the floor, her scalp still sore and scabbed. Her head felt lighter, yes, but in a hollow, aching way. Something vital had been taken, and she could feel the void it left behind like a missing tooth in her soul. She did not cry. Instead, she listened. At first, it was only the usual forest sounds, the chirping of insects, the occasional hoot of an owl. But sometime past midnight, the wind changed. It rose with no warning, slicing through the trees in unnatural gusts. The sound wasn't a whistle or a moan but something closer to a whisper, high and curling, as if words were being spoken but could not be understood. Leone stood slowly and went to the barred window. The trees beyond the hut thrashed violently, though the sky was clear. Leaves spiraled through the air like birds fleeing something unseen. Then came the knocking. Not at the hut's door, but far off, a knock against wood, then another, closer, like hands drumming against every door in the village. Dogs barked, hens shrieked. Lights flickered behind shutters. And soon the screams began. Villagers rushed into the square before dawn, their eyes wide and voices frantic. They spoke of hair, black strands wrapped around door handles, strung across thresholds like silent warnings. One man had found it twisted tightly around the feet of his goat, which lay dead in its pen, eyes bulging. A woman sobbed as she described waking to find several strands coiled around her throat, soft and cold and tightening by the second until she'd screamed and the hair fell limp. Another man brought a strand still clinging to his palm. He had tried to burn it, but the flame had gone out. When he buried it, it appeared again an hour later on his porch. By morning, a kind of hysteria had taken hold. The elders reconvened in secret, their voices sharp and trembling. This wasn't supposed to happen. The punishment had been carried out by the book, the rituals followed. Why was the hair not gone? Someone mentioned the girl. Locked in the hut, alone, untouched since the punishment. Perhaps she had cursed them. Perhaps she had called something back to her. One elder suggested removing her from the village entirely, exile, even execution. Another warned that harming her again might bring more than just wind and strands. Meanwhile, in the punishment hut, Leone sat cross-legged on the floor, calm now. The air was warm around her despite the cold. A single strand of hair floated down through the barred window like a spider on silk and landed in her open hand. She curled her fingers around it and smiled, not out of joy but recognition. The wind outside dropped suddenly as if it had made its point. The village would not forget this night. And though no one spoke of it in the days that followed, the image of that hair wrapped around throats and doorknobs lingered in every heart. Strands continued to appear for a week, on windowsills tied to lanterns, tangled in the mouths of fish caught in the river. Some villagers began sleeping with knives under their pillows. And Leone, though silent, was no longer seen as merely disobedient. Something had changed in her. She didn't speak of revenge, didn't need to. The strands had done the speaking for her. The morning after the windstorm, Leone woke before dawn, though she hadn't slept much. The punishment hut was cold, but something warm stirred at the back of her neck, an unfamiliar sensation that made her eyes snap open. For a moment she thought it was just another dream, that strange dreamlike awareness she'd been sinking into ever since the cutting. But as she sat up, heart beating slowly, she reached for the nape of her neck and felt something real beneath her fingertips. Hair. Not a wisp, not stubble. Thick, soft growth, new, alive, and longer than it should have been after a single night. She scrambled to the corner where the window let in a small sliver of gray light. She turned her head and ran her hand along her scalp. It was covered. The skin, which had been scabbed and tender the day before, was smooth now, and the hair, dark, silken, dense, was sprouting in waves. It hadn't just begun to grow back. It was thriving. She didn't smile. Her breath slowed, her fingers trembling as they traced a strand already curling past her ear. It wasn't natural. She knew that. No human hair grew like this, not overnight, not with such speed. Something was happening. Something had changed when her hair was taken, when the strands were scattered. And now it had begun to return, called back by wind, by memory, by something else, something deeper and older. At sunrise, the door to the hut creaked open. Her aunt, Tenny, entered with food and a wool shawl, expecting to find a weakened girl shivering in silence. Instead, she stopped mid-step, her eyes narrowing. Her mouth dropped open. "Leone," she whispered. "What is this?" Leone didn't answer. She didn't know how. She simply turned her head slightly so her aunt could see the full scalp now covered in new black hair, still damp with dew. Tenny dropped the bowl of porridge, its contents spilling across the packed dirt floor. By midday the house was crowded with relatives. They came in silence, wearing worried eyes and wrapped in layers of wool and superstition. Sira had returned from the river early, sensing something even before word spread. When she saw her daughter, she touched her face without speaking and closed her eyes. "It remembers," she said. That evening, a healer was summoned from across the valley, a woman with pale eyes and long fingers, who smelled of bark and smoke. She said little as she examined Leone. She moved her hands slowly over the scalp, muttering beneath her breath, pausing now and then as if listening. After some time she sat back and looked at Leone's mother and the others. "She's been touched," she said simply, "by something that remembers itself. And her." No one asked what that meant. After the healer left, the house emptied again. Most were too afraid to linger. Leone lay down in her cot, staring at the rafters, feeling the weight of her hair again. Already, it reached the tops of her shoulders. The sensation of it brushing her skin was strange, almost electric. She brushed her fingers through it, and for the first time she heard it. A whisper. It wasn't a voice exactly, not like her mother's or the healer's. It was softer, like water moving over rocks or wind twisting through reeds. It came not from outside her head but from within, riding along each follicle like a root system connected to something distant. She froze, then reached again, brushing slower. The whisper came again. Not words, not at first. Just feeling. Memory. Pain. Cutting. Fire. Wind. Flight. She recoiled and sat up, heart racing. The room was still. Her mother slept in the next room, breathing softly. Leone ran her hands through her hair again, testing it, searching for the voice. This time the whisper came clearer. "You are not empty." The words were like warmth down her spine. Not spoken in a tongue, but carried in the bone-deep way dreams carry meaning. She touched her scalp gently and closed her eyes. The strands seemed to lean into her fingers, like roots toward water. In the following days the hair grew faster. Within 2 days it reached the middle of her back. By the end of the week, it once again kissed the floor when she walked. Villagers began to look away when she passed. Some crossed themselves. Others whispered of witchcraft, of spirits, of punishment undone. But Leone had changed. She was not the same girl who had stood in the square with blood on her scalp and silence in her mouth. Now she moved with the grace of someone who had nothing left to prove and nothing to fear. The whispers in her hair were stronger now. Not constant, but present, flaring up when she touched the strands or when the wind moved through them. Sometimes they showed her images, of water coiling like a snake, of stones tumbling into rivers, of hands slicing through thick locks with iron blades. She began to understand that her hair was not just part of her, but part of something else, something that had remembered its severing and refused to remain broken. Sira watched her closely, but did not speak against what was happening. She had seen too much to fear it now. The night before the full moon, she took Leone's hand and led her down to the river's edge. "They think this is a curse," she said, her eyes reflecting the moonlight. "But it's a remembering. Not just of pain, but of what came before the pain." Leone didn't speak, but the hair whispered again. A feeling, not words this time, of depth, of history, of bones buried in riverbeds and roots growing through time. That night, she dreamed of herself not as a girl, but as a tree, tall and ancient, with hair for leaves and rivers in her veins. She saw others like her, once strong, once feared, their strands flowing into the soil, connecting them. She woke weeping. By now the elders had noticed her growing power. They heard rumors, children seeing strands of hair moving on their own, animals bowing their heads when she passed, dreams full of whispering rivers. The elders met again in secret, voices rising in fear. One of them argued that she should be banished before the village was cursed again. Another insisted that if they touched her now, the rivers might truly rise this time, not to warn but to claim. The youngest elder, who had remained silent during her punishment weeks earlier, finally stood. "We thought cutting her would end it," he said, "but it woke something instead. We scattered her strands to the wind. And now the wind has brought them home." The others said nothing. Leone, in the meantime, continued her quiet life. But she could feel the hair becoming more than just a return. It was becoming a kind of presence, a memory that lived in her, through her. She began to brush it with slow reverence, and each time the whispers grew louder. They taught her things, not spells but truths. Of how the river once chose guardians not with chance or robes, but by memory. Of how the first women braided their hair into nets to catch dreams, how cutting it had once been a mourning act, not a punishment. She wove her hair into braids now, not for beauty but to bind it with purpose. Birds came near her without fear. Water responded to her presence, rippling when she passed, rising to meet her hand. The villagers watched from a distance, fearful but reverent. One night, a girl named Meiji, barely 12, came to her door. Her hair had been cut by her father as punishment for dancing under the moon. She asked Leone if it would grow back. Leone said nothing. She placed her hand on the girl's scalp, closed her eyes, and let the whisper come through her fingertips. It was not Leone who answered. The next morning Meiji's hair began to grow again, slowly but surely. Word spread, quietly but insistently. More girls came. Some had been shamed for their hair, some for their laughter, some simply for taking up space they weren't supposed to. Leone didn't promise them miracles. But she let them sit with her. She brushed their hair. And when they left, the wind followed them. What had begun as punishment had become something else. And still Leone's hair grew. It no longer obeyed time. It remembered its own shape, its own strength, and it remembered Leone, the girl who had stood bleeding and silent in the square, and who had refused to be emptied. What grows in silence, after all, is not always weakness. Sometimes it is roots. Sometimes it is resistance. And sometimes it is a voice learning to speak again, one strand at a time. Midnight came like it always did, wrapped in shadows and distant owl cries. The village lay in uneasy stillness, tucked beneath the thick arms of the forest and the edge of the river. Clouds muffled the stars. Every door was bolted, every window drawn tight. Even the dogs had gone silent. But sleep did not come easily anymore, not since the night of the scattered strands. In the square stood the old bell tower. It hadn't been used in decades, not since the last flood, when the elders declared that warning should come from men, not metal. The bell itself was cracked at its base, too unstable to ring clearly. Children were forbidden from climbing its rotting steps. Everyone knew it stood only as a relic, an empty gesture to time. So when the bell tolled once, low, slow, deep enough to rattle window panes, the entire village woke. People sat upright in their beds, unsure if they dreamt it. Mothers clutched their children. The baker's boy ran out barefoot into the street, only to retreat seconds later with wide, frightened eyes. He swore the bell had moved, even swayed. Yet no one had climbed the tower. The bell had rung itself. In Leone's house she did not wake startled. She had been waiting. She had felt the pull, the strange hum beneath her skin since dusk. It was in her bones now, this rhythm of return. She rose from her cot and stepped out onto the wooden floor, bare feet silent. Her mother remained asleep in the other room, face turned to the wall, unaware or perhaps choosing not to see. Leone stood by the open window, hair hanging to her calves now, heavy but alive. It shifted when she breathed, curling softly like smoke as though listening. The wind stirred, though the trees beyond didn't move. Then something touched her wrist. It was a strand. Not one of hers, not the new hair, the fresh growth that had returned since the punishment. This was something older. She knew the texture. It felt like memory. She looked down and saw the strand coiled loosely around her hand, quivering gently. It glowed faintly under the moonlight, glistening like it had passed through rain. And then another came, slipping through the slats of the window, then another, brushing the doorframe, easing across the floor like a river of black thread. They came in silence, crawling, floating, twisting through cracks and under doors. Some emerged from the walls. Others slipped through the chimney like smoke, unburned. They were not frantic. They were purposeful. They knew where to go. They had been searching and now they had found her. Leone stepped aside and knelt on the floor. She held her hands open, palms facing the ceiling, and bowed her head. She did not cry. She did not speak. The strands wound themselves into her hair with slow reverence. Not tangling, not forcing. Weaving. They slid into her scalp, not with pain but with a warm, growing ache as if nerves were waking up. She could feel each one join the root of her being, stitching together what had been severed. Not just hair but memory, wholeness. The whispers came louder this time. Not chaotic but chanting. A language long gone from human mouths, yet still understood in the marrow. A welcome. A homecoming. Outside the village began to change. It started with the ground. A faint tremble, not enough to knock anything over, but enough to be felt in the soles of feet and the foundations of homes. In the fields the wheat bent without wind. Along the river, the water sloshed upwards against the banks as if responding to a heartbeat. The earth was restless. By the time the villagers gathered in the square, torches held high, the tremors had grown steady. Dust fell from rooftops. Horses stamped their hooves. And the bell, silent after its single toll, stood still once again but not untouched. Fresh strands of hair now hung from its iron frame, swaying gently, tied into knots only Leone would have known. The elders were among the last to arrive, their faces pale. One of them fell to his knees when he saw the strands on the bell, murmuring an old name that hadn't been spoken aloud in years. Myru, the river mother, the forgotten guardian. Someone pointed toward the forest path. A figure walked toward them. Leone. Her hair was full again, but not just long. It shimmered faintly with every step she took. It moved not behind her, but around her, a cloak of motion and memory. As she approached, the villagers backed away without meaning to. Not out of hatred now, but awe and something older than awe. She didn't speak, but the whispers followed her like a tide. She stepped into the square and stood beneath the bell. The earth pulsed. It was then that the old priest, the one who had retired 10 years ago and hadn't spoken publicly since, emerged from his hut. His beard was yellowed with age, his spine curved like a question mark. But he walked straight to Leone and fell to one knee. "I saw it in my dreams," he said, tears running freely. "The return. We buried it, burned it, scattered it, but it never forgot. And now it remembers." Leone lowered her hand and touched the priest's shoulder. Her fingers left a faint mark, not a bruise, not dirt, but something like ash or river silt. The priest nodded and stood. "Tonight is the first return," he said to the crowd. "Not a curse. A restoration." The elders did not speak. Neither did the others. They stared at Leone, waiting, fearing, hoping. But Leone didn't stay in the square. She turned and walked past them, her hair leaving faint trails on the dirt. She made her way to the judgment garden behind the hall, the place where some of her hair had been buried. She knelt, pressed her palms to the ground, and the earth shivered. The soil split open, not violently but like a breath exhaled. From beneath, something pushed upward. Not roots, not bones. Hair. The buried strands returned, crawling upward through the cracks, clean and black, moving like water over stone. They wrapped themselves around her wrists and then vanished into her body. Leone breathed in sharply, her eyes fluttering closed. When she opened them again, they were darker than before, deep pools reflecting no torchlight. By morning, the tremors had faded. But the land remained changed. A new stream had appeared on the east side of the village, bubbling from nowhere, feeding into the river. Birds gathered near it in great flocks. A fruit tree that had never bloomed sprouted white flowers overnight. A stillbirth cow revived in the stable and suckled from its confused mother. But not all changes were welcome. One of the elders woke to find his tongue blackened. Another could not walk, his legs had stiffened like wood. A third vanished altogether, his bed cold and empty, the only sign of him a few gray hairs floating in the wash basin. Leone did not speak of them. She simply walked. Her hair trailed behind her, growing longer with each day, but never wild, never snarled. It followed its own order now, a river remembering its course. Some began to bring her offerings, flowers, shells, river water in clay bowls. She took nothing, asked for nothing. But she received their silence as a kind of understanding. The girl who had been punished, shamed, cut down in public view had become something else. Not just whole but returned. Not just alive but remembered. And the land had remembered with her. That night the bell rang again. Twice. The first to see was a child. He had wandered to the riverbank before breakfast, a small pail in hand and a slingshot hanging from his belt. He liked the quiet there, liked the way the reeds danced when no one was watching. But what he saw that morning made him drop his pail and run. Black strands. Long, wet, moving against the current. They came silently, gliding like water snakes, but they weren't snakes. He could see the shape of them, trailing like silk, looping and curling over the stones. They didn't drift passively. They moved upstream, twisting deliberately, curling through water like they were searching. By the time he returned with his father, the strands were gone. But they didn't stay gone. That afternoon, 2 fishermen found something floating near their boat, a silver fish, belly up, struggling. When they lifted it from the water, its gills fluttering, they saw the black strands wrapped tight around its body, woven into its scales. The second net came up heavy, too heavy, and inside it nothing but hair. No fish. Just thick, wet, tangled black hair, longer than any human's. By nightfall the whispers returned. People leaned out of their doors with oil lamps and fear. Someone went to the village well for water and pulled up a bucket full of hair instead, dripping and dark, clinging to the wooden rim like seaweed. By morning the square was full. The elders stood in a tight circle, their eyes grave, their backs straight with purpose. They had been silent for too long. Now they spoke. "This is not healing," said one. "It is invasion." "She stirred the river gods," said another. "She summoned more than memory. She's crossed a line." "The hair moves without her," said a third. "We all saw it." Voices joined in. "They're in the fields, wrapping around the wheat. My cow choked last night, hair in its mouth." My daughter says her bed whispered to her. The fear was real now, tangible. Not superstition but something they could see and feel. Something they could not control. She must be exiled. That's what the head elder said. His voice was calm, final. She must leave before the village becomes a grave. But before they could send anyone, before the torches could be gathered or the dogs let loose, Sira, Iluni's mother, stepped forward. She had not spoken at any of the meetings. Not since her daughter's punishment. But now she stood tall, her hair wrapped in a cloth, her hands steady. You think you know what you fear, she said. You do not. They turned to her. Some scoffed. Others simply stared. Sira stepped forward, eyes on no one and everyone at once. When she was born, she said, she came with her eyes open. There was silence. And her hair already growing. A few mutters. One gasp. She didn't cry, Sira continued. Not once. But the midwife screamed. Because the hair, it wrapped around her neck. Another elder began to speak, but Sira raised her voice over him. Not to strangle, she said. To sing. They stopped. Yes, Sira whispered. I saw it. The midwife did too. She's dead now but she knew. The strands moved like breath, weaving a cradle around her throat. And I swear by all the gods you pray to, the hair hummed. She closed her eyes for a moment, remembering. A low, pulsing sound. Like river song. Like lullabies from under the water. More silence. No one believed me. They thought I imagined it. They said it was blood loss or grief or madness. So I never spoke of it again. Until now. Someone spat into the dirt. That's unnatural. Another voice. That's evil. But Sira looked straight at the head elder. You think this is her fault? She said. The hair in the river? The fish? The well? She pointed behind her. You're not watching carefully enough. The land is feeding itself again. The fruit trees grow. The rains fall at the right times. The sickness in our children is gone. Pause. But you only notice the hair. The elder's mouth opened, then closed. Sira stepped back. She was born of the river, she said quietly. And the river remembers its own. That night, no decision was made. But as the people returned to their homes, some looked toward Iluni's house not with hate, but with hesitation. Curiosity. Even reverence. Because deep down beneath their fear they wondered. What else had they forgotten? And what else had returned? Iluni dreamed again. She stood at the edge of a cliff that faced no land, only sky. Above her, stars shimmered not as distant fire but as tangible things, close enough to touch, each pulsing softly like a heartbeat. The wind carried a sweet, earthy scent like moss after rain, and there was singing, wordless and haunting, as if the stones themselves were humming lullabies. From the darkness stepped the women. They moved without sound, and yet their arrival stirred everything. There were 3 at first, then 5, then countless more emerging from the air itself. Their hair was long, impossibly long, black and silver and auburn, some coarse as tree roots, others fine as spider silk. Their hair moved like rivers, curling around them, winding through the stars above. Iluni could not see their faces clearly. But their eyes shone, not with light but with memory. One woman knelt beside her and took a strand of Iluni's hair in her fingers. She didn't pull or twist, just studied it, then gently braided it with her own. The sky shifted. Iluni looked up and saw constellations changing, stars aligning and weaving into patterns she didn't recognize. Threads of light stretched between them, braids of celestial hair winding from one bright point to another. The women were stitching the sky, strand by glowing strand. A voice, not spoken but felt, wrapped itself around Iluni's thoughts. Hair remembers. She woke before dawn, sweat-soaked and breathless. The dream clung to her ribs like wet cloth, yet she wasn't afraid. The room was still, the coals in the hearth long cooled. Her mother's door remained closed. Iluni reached for the comb beside her bed, the carved wooden one she had used since childhood, but her hand paused. Her fingers hovered, then withdrew. She didn't brush her hair that morning. She didn't braid it. She stood before the mirror, the old one with river-polished glass, and let her hair fall wild. It was nearly floor-length again but different. Thicker. Weightier. It held warmth even in the cold. And when she turned to walk away, she swore she saw movement in the mirror, not her own, not a trick of light. A woman. Pale-eyed. Watching. The visions continued. In puddles left after rain, in the polished obsidian of her mother's sewing needle case, in the quiet glint of metal, Iluni would see them. The threaded ones as she began to call them. Sometimes only one, sometimes dozens. They never spoke aloud but they didn't need to. Their lessons came in shivers, in the prickling sensation at the back of her neck, in the way her hands knew how to twist a knot she'd never been taught. They taught her how to listen, not just to people but to fibers, to roots, to silence. Hair remembers. The phrase came again and again, in dreams, in glimpses, in the rustling of dry leaves outside her window. She began to repeat it under her breath, sometimes without realizing. She whispered it into her pillow, into bowls of water, into locks of her own hair before sleep. Soon she stopped tying it back at all. She let it roam. At first it only moved in sleep. She'd wake to find strands fanned across the room, tucked beneath doors, coiled under the bed, wrapped gently around her wrist or ankle. Her mother said nothing. She had long since stopped pretending that this was ordinary. Then the movement came in daylight. She was walking to the stream one morning when a curl of hair slid across her shoulder and reached out toward a low branch. It wasn't tugged by wind, it moved with purpose, brushing the leaves, touching them like fingertips. Leone stood still and the hair moved on. Another day she passed a crying infant outside a neighbor's home. Her hair slipped forward, brushing the baby's cheek. The child quieted instantly. She began to realize, it was listening, watching, responding. And she no longer feared it. Some villagers noticed. They pretended not to. They didn't dare speak to her, but their eyes followed. Children stopped staring. Adults crossed the road. Yet no one touched her. No one called her names now. Even the elders kept their distance, uncertain if she was a danger or a miracle. The only one who dared approach was a girl named Nima, no older than 9, with wide eyes and a missing front tooth. She crept up to Leone one afternoon near the willow trees and asked, "Does your hair ever talk to you?" Leone knelt and smiled. "Sometimes," she said. "But not with words." Nima looked thoughtful. "Mine gets tangled a lot. Maybe it's trying to say something." The girl giggled, then ran off. That night, Leone stood barefoot beneath the stars. Her hair writhed around her feet, slipping into soil, tasting it. She tilted her face toward the constellations and whispered to them. The sky answered. A breeze rose, not harsh but deliberate. Her hair lifted, coiling upward, reaching toward the heavens. And once again she saw them, the threaded ones, not just in dreams now but reflected in the night sky. They stood between stars, braiding comets into arcs, spinning solar threads across galaxies. And they looked at her with knowing. She whispered, "What am I becoming?" They did not speak. But one held out a braid of star stuff, and Leone felt it settle over her shoulders like a mantle. She did not sleep that night. She sat in silence while her hair wove itself slowly through the floorboards, reaching outward, anchoring her to the land. By dawn, the wind in the trees hummed the melody from her birth, the one her mother spoke of, the song of breath and river and root. And for the first time in her life, Leone was not becoming something else. She was returning to what she had always been. They came for her at dawn. 6 elders and a dozen more with them, villagers who kept their eyes low and mouths shut. They didn't bring torches or drums. This wasn't a festival. It was a binding. They found Leone where they expected her to be, at the base of the old tree near the river bend, where roots broke from the soil like knuckles. She did not run. She didn't speak either. She merely looked at them with calm, endless eyes, her hair coiled at her feet like a sleeping animal. The head elder held a length of iron chain, rusted but heavy. Another carried a satchel of salt. They had prepared carefully, recalling the old rules, the warding rites from before memory, things buried in scrolls and whispered in fear. They had not used such tools in generations. But Leone had crossed a line, they said. Her power was no longer quiet. The altar post had not been touched in years. It stood on the northern edge of the village, worn smooth by weather and time, surrounded by thorn bushes and cold stones. No one remembered what the altar had once been used for, prayers, punishments, offerings. But its name remained. And names had power. Leone was led there in silence. She walked with dignity, her back straight, hair trailing behind her like shadow. Some of it brushed across the toes of those around her, and they flinched. It moved even when the wind did not. At the post, they bound her wrists first, iron cuffs clamped tight with trembling hands. Then the chain looped around her waist, across her chest. The salt came next, poured in a circle around the base of the altar, forming a barrier that none dared cross. Still she did not resist. She said only once, her voice low and steady, "This changes nothing." The elders ignored her. Their plan was already unfolding. They had gathered their sharpest blades, some of steel, others of obsidian, even one of flint from the old hills. They had no intention of killing her, only of taming her, of undoing what she had become. The first elder stepped forward and raised his knife. Leone closed her eyes. The blade touched a strand and shrieked. Not Leone, the knife. A sound rang out high and grating like iron biting stone. The blade cracked down the middle and flew from the handle, landing in the dust. The second tried next. His blade rusted before it reached her hair, blooming orange corrosion that spread like moss. His hand blistered. He dropped the knife, gasping. The third did not even lift his tool. His eyes rolled back and he crumpled. The others stepped away, fear blooming in their chests. Her hair was alive now, more than alive. It was aware. Still bound, Leone raised her head. Her hair stirred. It lifted slowly from the ground, curling through the air like smoke. It did not strike. It simply hovered, waiting. The elders left her there. They told the village they would try again in the morning, that they needed stronger metal, better salt. But none of them slept that night, because the hair did not stay at the altar. It traveled. It moved across the ground like shadow at dusk, thin, silent, invisible at first. It slipped through windows and under doors, coiled through the cracks in walls and thatching. No one saw it until it was too late. The first scream came from the baker's house. He had helped carry Leone. He had held her arm. That night, he bit into a warm loaf, and felt something coil in his throat. He spat it out, choking. A clump of black hair, still warm, curled in his palm. At the weaver's, who had offered up his scissors for the cutting, the loom jammed. He reached inside to fix the gears and found hair tangled deep in the wooden frame, hair that slithered around his fingers. A woman who had poured the salt woke with her mouth full. Not food. Not saliva. Hair, thick, warm, endless. She clawed at her throat, gagging, pulling strands from between her teeth. They kept coming. By midnight, the entire village was awake. They found hair in their stew, in their bedding, in their fire pits. One man lifted his infant to find the baby wrapped in a nest of black strands, sleeping peacefully. Another screamed when he found hair in his latrine bucket, hair that twisted up the handle toward his hand. No doors could stop it. No prayers kept it out. And it only visited those who had touched her. By sunrise, the elders returned to the altar, pale and shaken. Leone stood exactly where they had left her, iron still around her wrists. But the chain no longer held weight. The salt circle had blown away in the night wind. Her hair hung loose, silent, resting. It trailed behind her, spread wide like a veil. "You've made your point," the head elder said, trying to sound firm, but his voice cracked. Leone looked at him without pity. "I didn't send it," she said. The wind rustled her hair. Some strands lifted lazily. "It came because you asked for war." One of the elders fell to his knees. Another stepped back. The head elder tried again. "You're scaring the people." "You bound me," she replied. "And then you tried to unmake me." Pause. "You're scared of what remembers." She didn't wait for permission. With a single breath, her hair untangled from the iron, lifting the cuffs from her skin without sound. The metal dropped to the dirt with a dull clang. The chains slithered off her like water. She stepped past the broken salt line. No one stopped her. She walked back to the village alone. But from that moment on, the people watched their words more carefully. They did not speak Leone's name lightly. And they never again reached for her hair. Because now they understood. It was no longer something to control. It was something that listened. And it remembered everything. Leone disappeared without a sound. One moment she was there, walking through the market square, her hair a shadowy tide rippling across the stones. Then by the next breath she was gone. No one saw her leave. No one could say when exactly it happened. She simply ceased to be among them. The village, already tense from the unraveling events of the altar night, fell into a deeper silence. A silence that listened. On the second night, a boy named Kesho stumbled into the square, pale and shaking. He had wandered out to fetch water, unable to sleep. What he found stopped his breath. There at the village's heart, where paths converged and the old well stood dry, was the knot. A massive tangle of black hair, braided, looped, twisted in a way that seemed both intricate and impossible. It rose from the ground like a sculpture, reaching nearly to his shoulders, glistening slightly as if damp with dew. It pulsed faintly as if alive. It had not been there the day before. By morning everyone had seen it. They gathered in cautious rings around it, whispering. No one dared touch it, at least not at first. Children were held back. Even the elders stood behind the others, grim-faced, pretending to study it like a pest infestation. But fear bloomed under every word. Then the blacksmith's daughter, restless and bold, stepped forward. She reached out a single finger and touched the nearest loop. She dropped to her knees. Her eyes rolled back in her head and for a moment she was utterly still. Then she began to speak, not in her own voice but in the low, trembling tone of a man long dead. He confessed to stealing from the grain house during the famine. He begged forgiveness. She awoke a moment later, dazed and weeping, with no memory of what she'd said. That was only the beginning. By nightfall, 3 others had touched it. Each one dropped into a trance and each one gave up something they should not have known. A woman recited the dying words of her still-living mother. A young man described the night a fire had taken a child. Details only the arsonist should have known. A blind elder named Haru pressed her whole palm to the knot and whispered, "I see it now," before collapsing in sobs. From then on, the knot was feared as much as it was watched. It became a kind of unspoken test, a dangerous oracle. Some approached it willingly, desperate to know what it would draw out. Others were forced by neighbors who suspected them of hidden guilt. One man, accused of poisoning goats, was dragged forward. He touched the hair, and wept, not for goats but for the brother he had drowned in the river years ago. The knot, it seemed, did not care for accusations. It pulled only what was buried deepest. And the village began to change. At first, subtly, the baker stopped opening his stall. The healer refused to speak above a whisper. People passed one another in the streets without greeting. Children began drawing knots in the dirt, strange loops with too many ends. Then more openly, fights broke out over old disputes. A woman ran into the night screaming after a dream revealed her husband's betrayal. A home collapsed when its support beams, long ago replaced in secret with rotten timber, buckled under the weight of new memory. Walls came down literally and figuratively. People stopped repairing fences. Neighbors moved away from each other, redrawing boundaries. Some locked themselves indoors. Others left entirely, walking north with only what they could carry. The knot remained. It did not grow, not in size but in presence. You could feel it before you saw it now. Like humidity or grief. The air near it vibrated softly and sometimes you heard voices. Just murmurs, overlapping like 100 strands brushing together. And still, Leone did not return. Her home remained untouched. Her mother sat in silence most days, weaving bits of thread that unraveled as soon as she finished them. When asked if she knew where her daughter had gone, she only said, "She went where memory lives." The knot began to fray. Not crumble, fray. Small strands detached at its edges, curling outward like roots seeking soil. These tendrils did not move, not visibly. But they crept. Within days, the knot had tied itself to the well. Then the square's old stone bench. Then the base of the bell tower. Where the knot touched, truth leaked. The well began to fill again, not with water but voices. You could hear them if you listened closely. The bench cracked open to reveal bones hidden beneath it. Bones of someone long vanished, a girl no one remembered losing. The bell rang once, unstruck, and from its tower spilled ash, though the village had known no fire that year. One night, a farmer approached the knot with a lantern. He had decided to burn it. Said it was the only way to untangle the curse. He didn't return. They found his lantern days later, upright in the dirt. No sign of the man. Just a new braid spiraling up from the knot's base, one that gleamed the same color as his beard. A silent consensus grew. The knot would not be destroyed. It would not be moved. It would not be understood. So instead it was named. Some began calling it Leone's grief. Others, the root of memory. Children whispered the heart hair. But the most common name was the midnight knot. No one remembered who said it first, but it stuck. And still, secrets poured. A ledger appeared at the foot of the knot, though no one had placed it there. Its pages turned slowly in the wind. On them, in looping black ink, were confessions. Names. Dates. Details from a century of lives. A list of every cruelty, every silence, every unmarked grave. People began reading from it at night. Quietly in turns. Some brought candles. Some came just to listen, trembling. Some tore pages out in panic, only to find new ones had already replaced them. The village was unraveling. Not just in buildings, but in soul, in structure, in story. And through it all, Leone's name was never spoken above a whisper. Not out of shame. Not out of hate. Out of reverence. And fear. For it was clear now that she had not vanished. Not truly. She had become something else. Something larger than herself, something woven into the threads of time. And the knot was only the beginning. It waited. As if for the next hand to reach forward. As if it had more to show. She returned as if no time had passed. One morning, as fog coiled low across the village paths and dew clung to the eaves like breath held too long, Leone stepped back into the square. No trumpet. No bell. No wind to carry her steps. Just her, barefoot, quiet, watching the world she had once been bound in. Her feet touched the earth like she'd never left it. And behind her, moving with each breath and thought, was her hair. Not hair, not anymore. It shimmered like river light, thick and endless, braiding and unbraiding as it flowed. It wrapped gently around her shoulders like a shawl spun from shadow, trailed behind her like roots, coiling through the dust of the old village paths. The villagers, one by one, stepped out of their homes. They did not shout. They did not run. They knelt. All of them, even the elders, especially them, dropped to the ground like wheat before a storm. Heads bowed, hands open, lips parted with questions they no longer dared to speak aloud. Leone did not stop them. She did not smile. Her face was calm, unreadable, the way old trees are calm. She moved past them, through them, not with pride but inevitability. And her hair followed. The strands were not strands anymore. They were voices. They were time. They were remembrance given shape. Wherever it passed, the world softened. Weeds burst into flower. Dry roots cracked through stone. The air tasted of soil and salt and something older, something like sorrow but deeper. Children reached out to touch it. Not all of them, only the bold ones, the curious, the ones not yet taught to be afraid of wonder. One girl, hair in short knots and arms scabbed from climbing trees, touched a trailing strand as it brushed her cheek. She gasped, not from pain but from knowing. She saw a woman, cloaked in dusk, weaving rope beside a fire. She saw hands beaten raw, sewing cloth under moonlight. She saw feet bound with twine, running through reeds, carrying stories too heavy for voice. She saw 1,000 faces, blurred, weeping, laughing, silent, and heard them sing through time. The girl fell back trembling. Not hurt. Changed. More children followed. Some cried. Some laughed. One boy simply sat down and started drawing in the dirt, circles within circles, eyes without lids. Leone's hair showed no preference. It moved of its own will. Like a river returning to a dried bed, it knew where it belonged. The knot still stood in the center of the square. A little smaller now, a little looser around the edges. It had begun to unwind in the days before her return, but no one had dared touch it. Not since the ledger. Not since the bones. Now, as Leone approached it, it began to breathe. The strands pulsed and curled inward as though recognizing her. As though awaiting her. She stood before it without speaking. The crowd watched. Some wept. Some reached out and clutched each other's hands, their fear now reshaped into awe. Leone raised her arms. Her hair responded. It lifted slowly, majestically, as if gathering wind from an unseen current. It coiled in the air, twining toward the knot, reaching not to destroy but to merge. One by one, her braids joined the great weave at the center. They slipped into it seamlessly, becoming part of its pattern, completing loops left unfinished, closing stories left dangling. And the knot began to change. Not to disappear but to transform. The outer braids loosened. The tight coils unfurled. What once looked like a tangle now looked like a design. A doorway. An opening shaped by time and sorrow and survival. The people gasped. Because it was not hair anymore, it was architecture. Inside the knot, within the weave, you could see something else now. A corridor. A place that should not exist in air or dirt. Lit by a faint glow, pulsing like a heartbeat, the gate beckoned. But no one dared enter. Leone turned to the villagers. Her eyes were quiet, deep as the old river. Her voice, when she spoke, was not loud, but it carried like thunder filtered through a mother's song. This is not an escape, she said. This is a return. A murmur rippled through the crowd. She continued, her hands still at her sides, her braids shifting in slow spirals behind her. This is where memory lives. Where stories wait. Where the silenced go to speak again. The elders bowed their heads. No protest. No curses. They knew now what they had tried to forget. That power buried only festers. That stories silence become storms. That Leone had never been cursed, only called. A woman stepped forward, not young, not bold, but tired. She had lost a daughter years ago, claimed by the river. She stepped toward the weave, touched a low braid, and vanished. No scream. No crack of light. Just gone, gently like a breath returning to the sky. Another followed, a man whose grandfather had disappeared in a war none remembered. Then a boy too young to speak, toddling forward before his parents could stop him. He stepped into the gate and laughed. It did not take everyone. Some tried and were gently repelled, their bodies turned softly away, not yet ready. The gate knew. It chose. Or perhaps it listened. Leone stepped aside. She did not enter. The people watched her, unsure. Wasn't this her gate? Wasn't she the key? But Leone only walked to the side of the square, to the edge of the well where the first tendrils of the knot had grown. Her hair coiled around her feet, resting now. Waiting. The truth settled slowly like dust. Leone was the gate. The weave would remain because she would. Not as a jailer. Not even as a guide. As a living memory. As the storyteller. As the root. And so the village shifted again. Not in panic this time, in reverence. The square was cleared. A path was made. The space around the gate was honored, swept, sung to. Children were taught the names of the women whose voices filled Leone's hair. Songs were rewritten. Old crimes were named aloud. Some called her a goddess. Some a ghost. Some didn't name her at all, because what word can contain a whole history? Leone lived on the edge of the square, in a small home that grew moss and ferns around its roof. Her mother never stopped weaving, but now the threads stayed whole. They were gifts, not unravelings. And every so often, when the wind was still and the stars were bright, Leone's hair would stir and hum. Not loud. Just enough to remind the world. Remembering is not punishment. It is power. And the weave lives on. It begins as stories do, with time. Time enough that those who lived the fear are now grandparents. Time enough that the gate of hair at the village center has grown moss at its base, and vines from nearby trees reach toward it like supplicants. Time enough that Leone is no longer called by name in every breath, but simply she, the one who was never truly gone. The village is different now. Not unscarred but changed. Its roots are still the same, stubborn, gnarled, familiar, but its branches stretch wider. The old codes, once carved in stone by fearful hands, have softened. The iron post at the altar lies rusted in the grass. No one remembers the last time it was used. But everyone remembers why it will never be used again. No one cuts a girl's hair in punishment now. That law, once silent and cruel, now lives only as a warning told to children, not with fear but reverence. Mothers say it softly, not to frighten their daughters but to remind them, what grows from you belongs to you. Hair is no longer shame. It is inheritance. It is pride. It is resistance. When a girl is born, her first curl is saved in a ribbon-tied box. When she turns 12, she walks with her mother or aunt or older sister to Leone's house, which is no longer just a home, but something between shrine and sanctuary. Its door is always open and always smells faintly of rain and earth. Inside, Leone waits. Older now, yes, but not old. Her hair longer than ever, still moving gently as if breathing. She is not a goddess, though some still whisper so. She is not immortal, though she carries the weight of memory like one who has lived 100 lives. She is simply there. As she has always been. As she will be until she is no longer needed. Each girl kneels before her. Leone does not speak unless the girl does. Some offer stories. Some ask questions. Some weep without knowing why. Then Leone lifts a single strand of her own hair, always the same one, silvered near the root, and weaves it gently into the girl's braid. That braid, once finished, is never undone. It becomes a marker, not of status or pride but of remembrance. A visible thread tying each girl to a lineage larger than her name. A promise you will never be silenced. Not by shame. Not by blade. Some girls keep their braid loose and wild, others pin it with flowers or charms. One girl carved beads from the bone of a fish and strung them through, saying, "So I remember to be slippery when they try to hold me still." The wind, too, remembers. On stormy nights, when the rain lashes and the trees bend low, the air sings her name, not in words but in knots. Braids form in the grasses, in horse manes, in the cords of fishermen's nets. A baby's blanket tangles into loops overnight. No one combs them out. To untangle the wind's braid is to forget a lesson. So they leave them, and in the morning they burn sage and say thanks. Not for protection but for presence. For the reminder that memory is not a punishment. It is a thread we choose to keep. There are those who come from faraway places now. Travelers. Pilgrims. Outsiders who heard rumors. Of a woman who never died, of a village built on hair, of a gate that remembers. Some come with offerings. Others come to ask. One came to beg forgiveness for a war started generations ago. Leone met him at the gate. She asked for the name of his grandmother. He gave it. She smiled. The gate opened and he stepped inside. Others are not granted entry. But they do not leave empty-handed. Leone touches their hands or whispers to their dreams. And always something shifts. Some return home with tears. Some with new songs. One woman carved a poem into her arm in a script that did not exist before she visited. The village, once closed and fearful, now welcomes gently. But it still tests. It listens. The square feels like a held breath, quiet, sacred, aware. Nothing is built there anymore. Not stalls. Not homes. The knot remains, though changed. Not a monument. A threshold. Children play around it, never on it. They place ribbons and shells at its edge, tell stories to it as if it's listening. And perhaps it is. At the edge of the square, Iluni's house stands like a tree grown from a seed of grief. Its walls hum softly. Her garden grows strange things, vines that hum when brushed, petals that twist like coils of hair. She walks each morning before dawn, her feet bare, her braids swaying behind her like shadows waking. She touches the stones, the trees, the old altar post now part of the earth. Her presence blesses without claiming. She does not lead. She does not command. She simply is. And in her being the village has changed. Women speak more now. Not louder, just truer. The loom in the elder house weaves only what the girls choose to thread. No one marries because of land. No child is named after someone cruel. And every daughter is told of the girl who was never cut. Not because she couldn't be, but because the cutting changed nothing. She still grew. She still returned. She still became more than they feared. The girls listen, wide-eyed, hair curling around their shoulders, some freshly braided, others wild and free. The story never ends the same way. Sometimes Iluni walks into the sky. Sometimes she becomes a tree. Once, a child said she turned into a fish and swam upstream to braid the river's teeth. Every version is true. Every one of them. Because memory is not a single thread. It is a weave. And Iluni, the girl who was never truly cut, is part of it forever. Even if one day her house crumbles and the knot fades and no one living remembers her name, the wind will still braid itself when storms come. The stones will still shift slightly when a girl refuses to bow. And the world will still remember that hair, like history, grows back stronger when honored.